Good evening. With Parliament returning from the summer break, it's the first day of term for new MPs. But for Ilford South's Jas Athwal, it's been a less than stellar start. The Prime Minister joining the criticism of the state of his rental properties in the capital. The Labour MP has apologised after allegations tenants were having to live in flats with black mould on the walls. Sir Keir Starmer said it was unacceptable, but a renters' organisation is calling for Jas Athwal to resign. Here's our political correspondent Simon Harris.
I want to do for Labour nationally what I've done for Labour locally.
2 months ago, he was a council leader campaigning to become the local Member of Parliament. Now, Jas Athwal, the newly elected Labour MP for Ilford South, stands accused of being a rogue landlord.
Despite the best efforts of the residents to clean up things like mould, it just kept coming back.
Last month, London Assembly Conservative member Andrew Boff visited some of Mr Athwal's tenants and took pictures of mould on ceilings, loose wires on a staircase and smoke alarms in a far from ideal condition.
It was absolutely shocking, and I really couldn't believe it. I thought it must be somebody else who was the landlord of this particular problem, and I'd have reported them anyway.
Some of the flats are above an empty shop on the high road in Seven Sisters. Others are in a more modern block at the rear. The MP's property empire includes another 8 homes as well as the 7 flats here. We tried to speak to Mr Athwal today, but he didn't answer his phone and his office said he wasn't available. But in a statement he apologised, saying, "I had not been aware of these issues until this week, for which I am furious. I have immediately dismissed the managing agent of my properties. As the landlord, the buck stops with me."
It's unacceptable. What's happened in this case is this MP has now recognised that, is taking the necessary measures to put it right, and the sooner that's done, the better. But I'm not going to pretend to you or anybody else that this is in any way acceptable.
I welcome his apology this week, an unreserved apology. I welcome the fact he's sacked the managing agent who are looking after the properties that he owns, but also I welcome the fact that he's going to compensate all those tenants who are out of pocket.
But there are growing calls for Labour to take firmer action against Mr Athwal.
As a landlord, he is responsible to make sure that his houses are safe. He's responsible for following the law. We simply cannot trust our government to take care of us as renters and to solve a housing crisis with people like Jas Athwal in power. We think the only thing that is enough is for him to resign.
If they don't take any action against one of their number who's proven to be a rogue landlord, then what does it mean for the rest of their policies? What does it mean for renters in London?
This man, who asked us not to show his face, said he was leading a team of more than 10 builders brought in to fix the problems. Simon Harris, ITV News, Seven Sisters.
A car park next to a North London Underground station is set to be transformed with hundreds of new homes, despite pushback from the previous Conservative government and opposition from locals who rely on the parking spaces. The land next to Cockfosters station is owned by TfL, and as our political correspondent Simon Harris reports, it could be a change of use we're going to see happening more and more.
Cockfosters, the end of the line, and 3 miles from the M25, the station car park is a magnet for commuters and visitors to London. There are more than 400 spaces, but not for much longer. Transport for London has been given the green light to turn most of the car park into flats, leaving fewer than 50 spaces.
We've come all the way from Lincolnshire. We come down the A1, the M25. This is the best place to park.
If this was obviously, taken out of the equation, it would definitely impact me hugely financially.
This is just so easy for me. So, no car park's going to be... I have to park in a park or something, wouldn't I? Or park on someone's driveway. I think it's disgusting.
Well, I think it's absolutely disgusting because it means that residents in the area or people trying to use the tube and park their cars are going to have nowhere to park.
The controversial development will see 350 high-rise homes where passengers used to park. The original plan to build on the car park was vetoed by the then Conservative government in 2021. But now Labour's in charge and ministers have decided new homes trump parking spaces. The decision is a blow for campaigners who've been fighting to stop the scheme.
You can see how full the car park is today, and we have data from TfL, the Freedom of Information data, that shows it's effectively near 100% usage. So there's 300 odd cars that are going to have to go somewhere else if this car park goes.
It's an important park and ride facility. It's an important way that people get off the road network and onto the public transport network, and I think it's a deeply regrettable decision by Labour.
Sadiq Khan was delighted, saying building homes right next to public transport connections is a key part of our plans to deliver the high-quality homes Londoners need.
We've already seen at places like Black Horse Road, where we closed a car park and now have 350 homes, people adjust their patterns. Ultimately, it's a much better use of land for us to be bringing forward thousands of homes, including half of all those homes being affordable.
Similar developments are likely at other stations, but there's one group of drivers who won't lose out. At Cockfosters, 37 spaces will be set aside exclusively for London Underground workers. Simon Harris, ITV News, Cockfosters.
Well, one line in the response from Grenfell United sums up the anger towards previous governments and the distrust this one now faces. The system isn't broken. It was built this way. Our political correspondent Simon Harris is in Westminster. Simon, the new government has a really big challenge, doesn't it, to restore trust?
Yes, Duncan, in his statement to the House of Commons today, the Prime Minister said today's report had exposed decades of failings by both the building industry and governments. Failings which were acknowledged by the leaders of all the main parties.
So, Mr. Speaker, I want to start with an apology on behalf of the British state.
I want to extend my deepest apologies to the families and victims of the Grenfell Tower tragedy.
The report lays bare failings of governments of all parties over decades, and on behalf of my party, I am sorry.
MPs from across London were given the opportunity to tell the Prime Minister what they thought and what they wanted to happen.
He will be aware that the majority of the 72 that died were amongst the most marginalised and largely people of migrant heritage.
The shameless merry-go-round of buck passing that has happened for the last 7 years since Grenfell must now come to an end. Can he assure me that the government will now do everything in its power to ensure that criminal prosecutions will take place as soon as possible?
The conspiracy on testing of products is clearly going to be something that must be subject to criminal proceedings.
Mr. Speaker, Grenfell laid bare the truth, the sad truth, around the stigma attached to social housing. It's a stigma I still remember when people made assumptions because I lived on a council estate.
Simon, people want to see action as a result of this report. What are the chances of changes happening soon?
Well, Sir Keir said the Grenfell legacy would be the defining change he hopes to make as Prime Minister, but it won't happen overnight.
We will respond in full to the inquirer's recommendations within 6 months, and we will update Parliament annually on our progress against every commitment that we make.
So the survivors and the bereaved face yet another wait of up to 6 months before they learn which of the recommendations will be adopted. Sir Keir also cautioned MPs not to say anything which might prejudice the police investigation, saying the last thing Grenfell needs now is for anything to go wrong.
Thank you, Simon. Sadiq Khan has said Londoners will need to wait until next year to find out if and by how much tube and bus fares will rise. But for mainline trains, ministers in the new government will be setting the price. Every year, rail fares go up, often by more than inflation. It's now Labour's turn to decide how much passengers should pay. So what might that mean for the cost of tickets? Our political correspondent Simon Harris has more.
London's commuter train network has yet to make a full recovery from the impact of COVID. Working from home appears to be a lasting legacy of lockdown, and fewer commuters means less income from fares. But ministers will soon have to decide how much more passengers must pay for their tickets next year.
We know that the cost of taking the train is putting people off. For the last 14 years, we've had annual fare rises while fuel duty has been frozen. This needs to stop. We need rail fares to be frozen to encourage people to take the train.
There's no question money is tight, and not just because of former commuters working from home. In an attempt to end a series of strikes over the last 2 years, the government has sanctioned an above-inflation pay rise for train drivers.
If you look at the wages of some of the train drivers and then look at the wages of other public sector workers, it's exorbitant. And that's, I fear, if we all end up having to pay far more for our travel, that's where the money will go.
The government has traditionally calculated the increase using a formula based on July's inflation figure, known as RPI +1. In July this year, the retail price index was 3.6%. +1 would see fares increase by 4.6%. That might not apply to some fares on London's tubes and buses. Those are in the gift of the Mayor. And although TfL's business plan assumes a rise in line with inflation, Sadiq Khan favours no increase at all. In January, the Mayor announced a partial fares freeze. His opponents protested it was an election gimmick.
I froze fares again last year. We have the bus hopper fare, unlimited bus travel and tram travel within an hour. Londoners will have to wait and see until January about fares for next year. But if evidence from the last 8 years is to go by, we always raise them less than the rest of the country.
Sadiq Khan was hoping a Labour government would finally lead to a long-term funding deal for TfL. But when he met the new Transport Secretary just after the election, she announced, "I've not come with my chequebook." And coming down the track soon will be the next demand for a pay rise from the tube unions. Simon Harris, ITV News.
Rail fares, just one of the topics Simon will be covering with his guests on the late debates from Westminster tonight. He has all the details now from the studio.
Yes, on tonight's programme, I'll be joined by Labour's Rupa Huck, David Simmons from the Conservatives and new Liberal Democrat MP Paul Kohler. As well as rail fares, we'll look back over Sir Keir Starmer's first 2 months in Downing Street. Labour might still be in the honeymoon period, but there have been a few bumps along the road. Winter fuel payments for one. And only this week there were calls for a London Labour MP to resign after he was accused of being a rogue landlord. So plenty to get our teeth into. And of course, there's the Grenfell report with survivors and the bereaved asking if all of the recommendations will be introduced and when will they get justice. That's the late debate here on ITV1 after news at 10.